This is a short video explaining a document that is meant to be kind of a final review of the SOP and some of the problems that students occasionally have with the SOP. The document is linked on our Canvas page for this week right here, review of common problems with SOPs. And if I click on that document, it is going to look like this. And I want to do just a super quick walkthrough of some of the things that sometimes give students trouble. Now, I'm not going to describe every item on this list. A lot of them are self-evident. A lot of them you should be able to read the document and understand what it's saying, but some of them might require a little bit of context, and thus I'm going to make this video in order to provide some of that context. So one of the ones I worry will throw students off the most is this first one. I've got this kind of extended example here of an SOP that is just being overdivided. We've got, section 2.3, and then that leads to subsection 2.3.1 and then 2.3.1.1 and so forth. This is bad practice. I do occasionally see students do this. To be clear, I wrote everything on this page that we're going to be looking at, or everything in this document, but this is not an exaggeration. I have seen students who will divide and then subdivide and then subdivide to the point where the document becomes somewhat unusable. There is an alternative example down the page. I've got it labeled "This is better," and what I want you to notice about this is that we have a couple of lines of text per step. There is nothing wrong with that. Some students get fixated on the idea that every single individual item within the SOP should have a new division. Sometimes that leads to a much clunkier interface, and it creates a worse, less usable document. So there's nothing wrong with using kind of the sub-step. If we've got 2.4 and then there's a couple of different sub-steps within that bigger step, that's fine, but I wouldn't divide any more beyond that. I wouldn't, for instance, say 2.4.1.1, and do keep in mind that there's nothing wrong with a few lines of text per step. You're writing to human beings. People are capable of reading a couple lines of text and understanding it, so do not overdivide the steps. Next item on the next page has a similar problem. Sometimes students will overdo the labeling system. They will end up labeling a section called procedures as step number 3, or item number 3, and then by doing that they've kind of locked themselves into a system where every other item within the SOP is going to require additional levels of labeling. So if we're calling procedures section 3, that means that any subsections of procedures now need to be 3.1, and any subsections of those now need to be 3.1.1 and 3.1.2, and that just leads to an overly complicated labeling system that doesn't work very well. Alternatively, here's a better example. We could say procedures don't necessarily need to give it a number. There's no reason to. In fact, I don't even know if we need that word at all. We could just have section 3, preparing a gel. And now throughout section 3, the labeling system is just a little bit simpler, and that's a good thing. We don't want any more decimals than we need as the user is working through this. So this next section I am not going to read. I do want to just quickly point out what it's talking about. Occasionally students will go off on a tangent. They will start describing things that maybe don't matter for the main objective of the SOP, and in some cases they're doing this out of an impulse to be very helpful, and I appreciate that impulse, but at a certain point you've got to realize that the user is not going to care about negotiating better prices for the products, or that's maybe outside the boundaries of the SOP that you're writing. So please try to keep it focused on the activity that you're dedicating the SOP towards describing. Sometimes students will describe a lot of stuff that's maybe sort of outside the boundaries of the SOP, or doesn't matter that much. Likewise, make sure you're putting information in the proper order. To give one example that was out of a student SOP, there was a student who described an SOP on drawing blood and labeling the blood and all the steps involved in collecting blood, and the very last step involved a series of questions that the patient must answer before giving blood, which made no sense at all to have that at the very end of the SOP. It should have been much sooner in the SOP. So pay attention to the order of the information, and make sure you don't have anything that's sort of wacky or out of order. So this one is a really important one. If you are doing an SOP that involves a computer interface, please make some sort of distinction between the language in the SOP and the language that should appear on the screen, or that you're asking the user to type into the computer program. For instance, this right here is bad practice. Select the option Analyze Data and then press Enter. There is nothing distinguishing Enter filter or analyze data from the language of the SOP, and we need something. We could do bold font, we could do quotation marks, you could do underlining, all capitals are used at times, and any of those can work, but there needs to be something that allows the user to recognize the difference between the language of the SOP and the languages on the screen. Now on the next page, there's just other miscellaneous problems, and to be honest, I think most students could read through this and understand the point. I just want to highlight a few of the more important ones. Please do not list the warnings as if they were steps. If a user sees a label of the next step in an SOP, like 3.3 or 3.4, that should signal that there's a new action that is going to take place, that the SOP is explaining the next step that the user should do. If that is not a step but is instead a warning, don't label it as a step. Don't call it 4.3, instead call it warning or caution, or in some cases note or example or explanation. Any of those are usable things in an SOP or viable options in an SOP, but don't label explanations or warnings as if they were steps. Next item, don't overdo the warnings. I'll let you read that. I'm going to skip down to number 5 here. It is a problem that I see often both in SOP writing and just in writing in general. If you have the word this or it, please take a moment to be sure that it is clear. Sometimes this can be totally clear in your mind, but in the user's mind, it may not refer to something that's obvious. And if there's any potential doubt on what the this is or the it, just take a moment to redefine it within the SOP or within whatever document you were writing. I'm going to skip down here again. A lot of these I think are self-evident. I'm not going to read them out loud in this video. I'm trying to keep things short, but let me just highlight number 10 and number 11. Please make sure that you include a purpose and scope section. Occasionally students just forget these entirely. They're not present at all in the SOP. You should have a statement at the beginning of the document that is self-referential, saying this is what this SOP covers. It explains how to do such and such, and it should go through and talk about possibly things the SOP does not do. If you're writing about a small section of a much bigger procedure, then acknowledge that. You might say something about the personnel qualifications or the training requirements that a person needs in order to do the procedure. There should be like a lot of preliminary stuff before you get into actually writing the SOP. Likewise, number 11, please avoid instructions without any clear context. If you're asking the user to press F9, give some hint as to what should happen if you press F9. There ought to be like some sort of explanation for that. Don't just write a series of steps with zero context. There ought to be some sort of explanation of what the steps should accomplish. Let's talk about figures for a second. Any sort of visual aid needs to follow a few guidelines. The first and foremost is to make sure that it is relevant and usable. If there's a photo that's very, very small, or there's a photo that is just not really all that useful or related to the actual activity that the person is doing, then take that photo out. This happens a surprising amount of the time. There will be some sort of photo or graphic that's just not useful in any way. You do need at least one graphic in this assignment, and make sure that it's usable. Make sure that it is labeled. It should say directly figure 1 or figure 2, and that there is an explanatory caption. You can look at the sample on making an agarose gel to see a good example of how to include figures. She does well with this. They're usable photos. She has labels. And she has explanatory captions, and they are placed appropriately. That's the other thing, is you usually want them close to where they're relevant in the document, and often it's good practice to refer to them explicitly in the steps of the document. At some point you say, please see figure 2 or whatever. So please make sure you're following those guidelines for visual aids, not only for the SOP, but for the writing we do in general. If you have any questions about any of the issues that students run into with SOPs, please get hold of me. I can answer those questions. I can look at a section of your SOP. I'd be happy to do that. And please pay close attention to one another's work as you're conducting peer review. Thanks for watching the video, and we'll keep in touch.